Hey there, welcome to the Reinsurance Podcast, the place where we dive into all things reinsurance, the coolest part of insurance. We're your hosts, Jared and Ben, a couple of ex-practitioners who loved the industry so much we founded Supercede to tackle some of its biggest headaches. And we're here to share our insights and stories with expert guests as we uncover what's really going on in the industry.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Reinsurance Podcast. Following Jared's introduction to the Reinsurance Podcast, I've decided to add my own. But welcome, Jared. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good, buzzing.
Your tee matches your shirt today, so you've got a whole theme going here.
There's a slight rainbow effect because we've also set a green background, so I'm not sure how well the other blends in. But this is part of my my Lloyd's lab gear, basically, because I'm going into Lloyd's later, and they've got all these balloons up in yellow.
Long gone are the days of mandatory ties and suits. It's T-shirt village over there now.
As long as I stick to the fourth floor where I'm allowed.
Yeah, exactly.
But we've got a special topic today, which is very much one close to our hearts in our Supercede roles.
Yeah.
Do people know what Supercede is? Should we remind them?
They can go to the internet, supercede.com, and learn all they need to know. We wanted to talk a bit about the relationship between the information cedents and brokers send to the market and capacity. And from both of our backgrounds, spend a bit of time unpacking, like, how does that actually play out? What does it mean for capacity to be constrained? What does it mean to sort of win or earn or get more capacity? How do underwriters think about allocating capacity? Not just in their own sort of appetite, but sort of to specific portfolios of risk. And then how do brokers think about, or what the role they play in helping the clients secure the best capacity as a part of this sort of submission process? So that's what we're going to sort of lean into today.
Sounds like an important theme.
It is an important. Well, in a hard market, it's especially important, right? And we're sort of coming out of the 1/1 renewal season. We're sort of leaning into what does 2025 look like. There's no signs this is going to be a soft market yet. So getting capacity is going to be incredibly important for cedents. So if we start with what the experience is like for underwriters, what are some of we've talked about bad data you've received in the past. But walk a bit through like the challenges you face when you receive submission data from a client.
Yeah, happy to. And I think maybe it's worth contextualizing how this has changed historically as well. Because again, a long time ago, the way this process worked was very light on the data, the information front. You know, you'd take a bet as an underwriter on a company based on its quality. You know, you'd think, oh, these guys or these people who run insurance company X, they seem to know what they're doing. They're nice people. I trust them. I'm willing to allocate some of my capital to them. And they've explained to me verbally, most likely, how their portfolio works. They've written me some intentions about how they plan to run their business over the next year, key hires they're making, key decisions they've made about the portfolio, lines of business they're going to include or exclude, regions or properties or types of business they're going to do at the expense of others, etc. And that was historically enough. And I say historically, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that was all that was needed. But then the market had this really big change where suddenly digital information started to be available. And I say digital, not really, kind of spreadsheet-based information started to become available where you could say, I'm not just going to describe it to you, I can actually show you evidence of what I'm doing. And as soon as underwriters realized that was possible, they started asking for it. They were like, oh, hang on a minute, this would be great if we can get, and again, this is still 20, 30 years ago, if I can get from my insurance company clients some information about what's inside the portfolios we're going to be reinsuring, that will enable me to be much more than just money, right? I can be an advisor, I can be a strategic partner, I can charge them a fair price, based on what they're actually underwriting. And so underwriters said, please, can you send me this information? I want to know the policy bordereau in as much detail as you can share. I want to see the premium estimates. I want to see the rate change information, the loss runs, and latest development of claims, etc. And what ensued then for the past 20 years, basically, was each reinsurer set out a slightly different list of requirements to the cedents. And every single one of those cedents, so these insurance companies, went off in their own direction, creating their version of what this submission data needed to look like. And that was the genesis then of, part one really of how submission information came to be like it is today and like it was when I was underwriting. So you'd go from one insurance company who would send you this elaborately structured spreadsheet with 400 tabs and color coding and all sorts of nuances, that you had to know really, really well from years of working with them to have a chance of interpreting, to another cedent who sent you a bunch of PDFs with some hard-coded tables that they'd learned was the way to do it, and then loads and loads of annotations and so on. And then another cedent that had their own completely different way of preparing the information. Yeah. And what that created, again, and it sort of organically got worse and worse over time as reinsurers have said, oh, could you also add this? Or could you also share this? Is pandemonium in the sense that every cedent's information is different and it's shared to underwriters who have no way of automating the collection or ingestion of that information that ultimately needs to go through the same standard process, which is find these bits that we need and put it into our pricing models so that we can come up with a price and also understand you a little bit better. What that means is we've gone from a position where originally the information was helpful to the client because they could say, look, trust us, here's information about what we do, to now that information being a massive liability because at the moment, if you're the cedent that shares too much information, for example, you could get caught out. If you're the one who shares too little, you could be caught out. If you're the one who shares it in a particular format that's unhelpful, you might go to the bottom of the pile because you're just so much work to do with. And so the market's really been missing this standardization of what that submission information needs to look like. Yeah. You must have seen this as a broker, right, as well?
Yeah. Well, and one of the challenges you have is if you think about some of the reasons the data looks differently but across different classes is sometimes there's a requirement for that. So you have not just like different classes of business have different fields or pieces, but even if you think about like a bordereau, a bordereau that's going to have a lot of PII or personally identifiable information, or is that the right?
Ding, ding, ding.
Yes, I knew it was in that ballpark. But if it has a lot of PII in the data, you can't actually send that to all your markets. So you'd have to anonymize it. But then what the parties will do is, because they can't send all the granular data out, what they're forced to then do is do this sort of kind of work around the numbers that they want and then just roll them into like buckets that you can't actually interrogate any further. But the likelihood that mistakes have been made that are now impossible to catch is incredibly high. There's a feature that we built in our platform that allows you to work through numbers in the raw, real data and then anonymize it on export. So even if you're only working with sort of the high-level numbers, there's like a verification built in to that work. But if you're just doing it in the spreadsheet, like the errors are like they're compounding because there's no like toggle of anonymity. So those are many of the reasons why this evolution towards this pandemonium that you've described exist. But on the broking side, you're trying to articulate to the market the specifics of the client's strategy and why that's a good strategy. We talk a lot around sort of high-level anecdotes and sort of generic positioning because we don't want to disclose too much experience. But there's one that I think is really interesting that maybe provides more sort of direct light on this. Several years ago, I was working on a Japanese tree, and what the portfolio was doing was the client was growing their business intentionally in sort of the condo renter market as well as the sort of standalone homeowners policy market.
Condo now sounds like a very Japanese word.
Yeah,
you said those two things next to each other.
It does. I wonder what the origin story is. We'll come back to that. That's a tangent for another day. But what you're trying to do then is say to the reinsurers that not only is this portfolio going to grow in premium, a portion of that growth, a sizable portion of that growth, is going to be in this specific subsection of the book, and strategically so. And that growing subsection, this sort of condo sort of a comparison or similar, is a better risk portfolio. So there's growing premium there, but without sort of the matching growing risk or exposure that you'd have on the other parts, especially when you think about the cat exposure that Japan has. So what we were trying to evidence is a way to show the premium growth in the book is be compelling, but would be disproportionately growing in relation to the claims that would be incurred by this portfolio. And you were able to leverage the data that we had to sort of very clearly evidence that to the reinsurers. So it wasn't just, here's our strategy, here's the long narrative with a bunch of cute blurbs and a person we're hiring to do that, but it was using the numbers that we had to say, here's what we've done the last couple of years. We're doubling down on this strategy. And so this growth is going to look like this in these classes, and talk about the underlying rate changes to the various portfolios within their property book. So all of that being part of sitting down with reinsurance underwriters and being able to say, what is this client doing and why is it really interesting? We've talked before as well about securing capacity, and the Japanese market gets a lot of capacity and is usually amongst the biggest books in the world. Their data is good quality when it goes to market. and I phrase it that way because the data struggles are the same as any other market. But one of the big differentiators between Japanese cedents compared to many other cedents in the market is that Japanese insurers have really large ceded re-teams that spend huge amounts of time and effort cleansing and organizing and working their numbers to get them to a point where the brokers, when they receive them, can do a lot of really helpful things on them. Most insurance companies in the world have far, far smaller teams and just sort of whack over the fence whatever they've got. So, but the ability to sort of leverage the data to articulate a good story and explain what is happening to your portfolio, in addition to other things the Japanese do which make them appealing, is one of the reasons, though, that the Japanese cedents are so compelling to reinsurers, right?
I think it's maybe worth continuing the story, because we started with the underwriter experience, we came on to the broker experience with the data, but the cedent experience, which you started to touch on there with the Japanese example, is quite important here, because you've got, as you said, on the broker side, this need to add a strategic angle, the need to evidence a particular story, that is guided very much by the brokers. The brokers know the market right now, so they say the thing that's going to get you the best terms is to really lean into this thing that you're doing. We just need to showcase it. I imagine, a lot of those conversations. However, as to the cedent, whether it's a big team you have for ceded re or a very small one, is having to manage that conversation on many, many fronts simultaneously normally, right? They're being asked by big broker X to send lots and lots of data to support one narrative, at the same time as often another broker, possibly even on the same deal, because co-broking is so popular nowadays, to send differently formatted data for another deal. And then simultaneously they're preparing another placement in a different line of business, possibly covering a different region, etc., that has to conform to a different standard. So the ask on the ceded re teams is really, really high and painful to respond to at the moment. And that's pre-placement, right? Getting the data pre-placement. Not to mention what happens then during the placement with underwriter questions coming in. Even after you finish responding to all of your different brokers' questions to get the data to where it needs to be. But I think often these firms, I think the Japanese example you gave is a really good one, because I think often these firms underestimate the value of investing in ceded re, because to your point, if you can win that capacity over and you can make your reinsurance purchase competitive, it can move the rates really sizably. If you've got a panel that people are kind of like meh about being part of, they're not going to allocate much energy towards winning a share of that portfolio, and so they'll float a pretty high quote for your reinsurance, and probably all of the other reinsurers will as well. At the other end of the spectrum, if yours is the most compelling portfolio that people want to be a part of, they can really cleanly and clearly see from the data why they would want to be a part of that panel. Then suddenly you've got many, many reinsurers all trying to quote under the others to beat each other to get a larger share of that portfolio, and that can move the rate 10 percentage points or more sometimes, right? Which, when you're spending often for many cedents hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, on your reinsurance every year, is pretty sizable. Literally your extra spend on ceded re data quality could be worth tens of millions of dollars to you.
Yeah.
Which is pretty mad when you think about it. You're umming and ahhing about, should we, get an extra ceded re person, or should we get some more technology?
Yeah.
The answer is pretty much always yes.
Yeah.
But the problem, I think, as part of that, is that talent is so scarce nowadays on the ceded re people side.
Yeah.
That I often, even if you did want to spend it on ceded re people, it's not an option. And I think that's why so many people are turning towards technology.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're right. We've talked about the impact that like price loading from the reinsurers would have. But you're right. If you have it where the investment you make on getting the data into a better spot and being able to the reinsurers have more confidence in it, and even if that gets you some basis point reduction on your rate, times by hundreds of millions or billions that go into that portfolio, like you are talking to the tune of tens of millions of dollars in the aggregate of a reduction there. But
not
because
to mention saving huge amounts of operational
right.
well.
But because it's sort of oftentimes bucketed and looked at as a cost center, this is the team that spends the money on reinsurance. Sometimes companies do that math in the wrong direction. They don't look at it going, well, this is money that will absolutely make itself back, where we'd invest a ton into this new, online website so people can come in. Like the underwriting side of the business always gets the attention because that's where the money comes in from, and they look at how they grow the sort of top line income of the business. But improving the sort of margins of the team that spends the most within your business, it's like you wouldn't if we use what are the biggest line items. So when you talk about what an insurance company's balance sheet and like things they spend on, reinsurance spend is amongst the top.
I think it's the top.
And that includes like office space worldwide. It includes things like salaries worldwide. Like it is huge. A worldwide insurance company isn't paying month to month on their leases around the world because it's not as cost effective as getting like 10-year leases for huge spaces to reduce. Like that is an obvious use of capital, to spend more money up front on big long leases for the office space you're going to have to the tune of tens of not hundreds of millions. But yet when we look at ceded re, which is an equally important, equally sizable spend, we're like, ooh, we should try to cut back at it. They're just looking at the numbers in a really weird way on ceded re at times.
I think I'd take it a step further and look at the key management ratios that are used by insurance companies to measure their performance, to gain investment from their shareholders, etc. Combined ratio at the top, which is the combination of the expense ratio and the loss ratio.
Yep.
They're all expressed, these ratios, relative to net premium, right? And the reason that's important is because you get to net premium by working out how much of your premium you get to keep after you've bought your reinsurance, right? So you do all this effort to write billions of gross premium. Let's say you write 4 billion of gross written premium, which lots of specialty carriers do. Yep. And then you give away 1 billion to the reinsurers, which now means that all of your ratios, when you're working out, okay, what's my general and administrative expense ratio? It's that total fixed cost and variable costs divided by the net premium, which is 1 billion less than it was, 75% of what it could have been if you were able to either pay less for your reinsurance, the existing protection, or in fact, you could do it the other way, which is also exciting, and spend the same amount but get more protection, which in turn makes your loss ratio better.
Yep.
Which again makes your combined ratio better. So there's like direct impacts from having a more effective reinsurance.
You could even double dip, do a little bit of improvement on the loss ratio and on the expense.
Reinsurance spend will improve your expense ratio. It will improve your loss ratio if you can optimize it, and ultimately that's going to improve your return on equity. Yeah. So
and like when you think about the decision makers that think about reinsurance and the spend there, like these are the things that have to be more front of mind. And there are like market cycles. We do have it where sometimes the reinsurance spend is higher and sometimes it's lower because of broader market conditions. But the cedents shouldn't be sitting there. Like it feels at times that there's these waves that will come through and the cedents are just like hanging on and riding what's happening. And sometimes the broker's going, oh, go that way a little bit because that's a little bit safer. But you have so much more control over, like, as you sort of pointed out, fundamentally improving the combined ratio of your business by moving one or two, if not both levers there. But so oftentimes the feeling is that, well, the market looks like it's softening, so we should get better, or it looks like it's hardening, and therefore we're going to just buckle up and pay a bit more, and that is what it is. It's not always what it is. There are other ways to continue to have control over this. And I think that's beginning to be seen by the market. The market is beginning to come around to this consensus, and it's through quality of data, it's through partnerships with brokers and the reinsurers. Like, this is all this, it's a collective effort by the industry, but it has a meaningful impact on the sort of most important numbers that sort of the boards talk about.
And on that meaningful, gravitas-related conclusion, it might be time to end.
That's the end. That's all we got today.
But thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Look forward to it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to the Reinsurance Podcast. If you enjoyed our show, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review to let us know how we're doing, preferably 5 stars. For more insights and updates, follow us on LinkedIn and visit our website at supercede.com/podcasts. You'll find the links in the show notes.